Hello friends, welcome back to our channel Demystify Frontend, and this is yet another video in the series Build Your Own Angular Forms, where we are creating Angular form package from the scratch. So in the last video, as you must have seen how we added the validation support in our ngModel implementation. So now let me quickly give you a walkthrough what we did in the last video. So basically in the ngModel implementation we added the support for the validation so that you can validate your inputs as well. So what we did, so we applied the required validation for first two inputs, that is first name and last name. So if I make it empty, then it shows a red border in the input and some error message down below the input, and same is done for the last name as well, right? So now I will show you how we did it and what are the shortcomings in that solution and why that solution won't scale. So on your screen, this is the ngModel.ts file where we implemented the ngModel directive. This is a very basic directive of the Angular forms, and you can say it is the heart of the template driven forms. Everything starts from here and then everything build up on top of it, ng form, ng model group and everything, right? So this is our ng model implementation, and if watch the last video, I made some changes in this to support the validation. So what we basically did, we defined one method here, set up form control, and which we call once when the ng model is set up for the first time. And what we do here, we basically create a validator function. So this is our validator function which takes a control having type abstract control, and which either returns the validation error or null depending on like whether your data is valid or invalid. So there is a video which I have already attached in the description, which basically deep dives into the concept of form controls, like how ngModel validate the data using the control. Form control is a class which keeps a track of the value, validity and the status of the form control, right? So it is where we basically validate our data, right? So first we set up the validator function, and then whenever you call the set value method on form control within the ngModel, it calls this update value and validity, which basically update the error and status flags, right? And these are the flags which we basically read in the template to show and hide the errors. Okay, so let's go back to the ngModel. So what we did, we set up a validator function and we simply set it here. Now, so what we are checking here, we are basically placing this validation just on the basis of this required property. So this is basically an input property, right? So what we did, basically we passed an input property. Let's say if I want to place a required validation, so I define one input property here, and I basically bind true to this required input property. So the ngModel earlier, it was just relying on the input properties, right? So this is only one type of validation, right? Now suppose you have a couple of more validations you need to apply. Let's say min length, max length, or email validation, or something else, or even a custom validation. So how will you manage that if we go by this approach? Because so what we are doing, we are making a check here, right? Now let's say if I have to make I have to apply another validation, all we'll have to do is like I have to make a check for, I'll have to accept another property, something like min length, right? And then I'll place another validation, and similarly if there is a max length, I place another validation. So you can see the code will keep growing as we apply more and more validation on this input element or any element where you have your ngModel applied, right? So this approach is not going to scale very well. So the main issue with the ngModel validation which we have implemented as of now is like we are referencing all the validations, right? So we have placed some hard-coded checks. If we have the required validation, then prepare a validator function. If we have a min length, then prepare a validator function separately. Similarly, if we have some other, let's say max length, then prepare a validator function and apply it on the control. So this way our ngModel it won't scale very well for different type of validations, because every time you want to apply a validation, you will have to make some changes in the ngModel, which is not very good approach at all, right? So instead of doing this, what we can do basically, in the ngModel we should only be worried about applying the validation on the control, right? So instead of defining all the validations within the ngModel, we should inject the validator function based on like which validation we have applied from outside, right? So now let me show you what I'm talking about. So if you see here, this is a flow diagram I have drawn here. So what we are doing basically here, This is our ngModel directive, right, which basically set up a validator function on the form control. So what we do basically, we will move the logic which handles the validation to another set of directives. And what this class will do basically, they will expose themselves on a DI token, and through that DI token ngModel can simply inject the validations from outside, right? So if we have like one validation, then this DI token will provide us that validation. If we have a couple of more validations applied, then this validator will provide us the array of validations. And ngModel can simply compose a single validator function and apply it on the form control. And this also gives us a room for applying the custom validation, because all we have to do is like defining a validation directive and configuring that DI token ng validator, right? Okay, so let's create the validation directive. Open source form source directives. Yes, just come at here under the directive folder and create one more file here and name it validators.ts. So here we will place all our validation directives. Okay, so before we start developing the validation directives, let me do a very quick refactoring. So let's go to the abstract control. Here we have some validation types defined. So ideally we should keep them in the validator.ts file. So I'll just select and cut the validation errors and the validator function, and I'll place it here. Okay, and let's import the abstract control. Let's fix the type errors here. So add all missing imports and go back to ngModel and remove these and re-export these types. Okay, and I guess it should fix now. Yeah, so it is fixed. Okay, so let's define the validation directive here. So this is going to be our required validation directive. Decorate it with the directive decorator, and let's decide what should be the selector for this. So first of all, we will have to specify the required attribute wherever we want to apply the required validation. And another condition is where we apply the required attribute, we should have applied the ngModel directive over there, because this required validation will work only for the controls where we have ngModel directive already applied. Okay, so now we will have to exclude one control here, that is checkbox, because there is no point in applying the required validation on the checkbox. So to do that, we will specify, we will update our selector here. So we should not include where we type, where the type is checkbox. Okay, now what will be required validation like? So we define an interface. Okay, so let's export an interface here and name it validator, right? So this decides the shape of the required validation directive, like what it is going to be like. So to be a required validation directive, it should implement a validate method. So this is a general interface which all our validation directive will implement. So to be a validation directive, I would say it should implement this validator interface, and it should define one method by the name validate, which will take the control having type as abstract control, and it will return either the validation errors or null, depending on the type of the data, whether it is valid or invalid. So let's quickly implement this interface. Okay, so let's add the method here and let's update the logic. Now if you go back to the ngModel directive and you see we had placed validation, right, required validation in the last video. So we will move this to the validation directive, because now this is the job of the validation directive to validate the data, not the ngModel. Okay, so now since we have defined our required validation, now comes the another part, like how ngModel will get access to this, right? To inject this required validation into the ngModel, first we will have to configure a DI token, and we will expose this required validation directive on that DI token, so that ngModel can inject that DI token and get access to the required validator directive. Okay, so let's do that. So for that, first we will have to define injection token, and I'll name it ngValidator. So if you watched my previous videos, we did the same thing for the control value accessor directives, right? So we exposed the control value accessor directives on the DI token ngValue accessor. Okay, so you can go and check out that. So let's define the injection token here. And injection token, so let's give it a type as well, injection token. And what type of token it will provide to us? It will basically provide the instance of the validation directive here, in this case required validator. So we can specify the type of the service it will provide. And here in the description of this token we can specify this ng validators. Okay, so now what we will have to do, we will have to configure this DI token through this directive. So let's define the key providers here, and in the providers array let's define the provide key. Let's ng validator. So when the ngModel asks for this this dependency, this DI token ng validator, then the dependency injector of the element where we have applied our required validation and where we have applied the ngModel, it should provide the instance of this required validator class. So we will be using use existing here, and we will specify the reference, right? Okay, so now let's go back to the ngModel directive and inject the DI token, right? Okay, so let's define the variable and give it a type validator. Okay, and what, so we will make use of inject. So that is a param decorator, we can decorate any parameter with this inject. So what we will basically trying to receive in this variable, we are trying to inject this DI token ng validator, which is configured by the required validator, right? And this is going to be optional because we have not applied the validation directive on all the form elements, right? So it can break for the rest of the form elements where we don't find this DI token value. So we will make it optional. So let's use the optional. So there is a dependency injection modifier, right? So they modify the behavior of the dependency injection system in Angular. Okay, so this is our, and let's define one more variable here, class level variable, which will capture the validator, right? And let's assign it to the validator. Okay, so now you can see here, like when we set up the form control, we are trying to set up the validation, right? So instead of relying on the required attribute, what we will rely if we are getting any validation. If we have, when we inject the validation from outside through this DI token ng validator, so we will check, are we getting any validator? So if we are getting the validator, we will simply call the validate method, which we defined on that validation directive, required validation directive, and we will simply pass it the control, right? And whatever that validator dot validator returns, we will return it simply, right? So now you can see we have decoupled the logic of the actual validation to different directive, right? So let's check it out if it is working fine. And in the template we don't have to make any changes, because if you see we have already defined the validation here. So for now it is not accepting any parameter, so we can also simply apply it as normal attribute, right? Okay, so now let's check if it is working fine. Let's check if it is breaking anything. Now I'll tell you one more thing here. So when you apply a directive and on some input, right, so how will you debug it whether it is applied or not, right? So there is a utility which Angular provides only in the development mode, which you can make use of. So what I do, I inspect the first element where we apply the required validator, and we will call ng dot get directives. So on the ng namespace we have a couple of utilities which Angular provides, right? And we will pass the inspected element. Now you can see where we have couple of directives applied, ngModel default control will access, but not the required validator, right? Now let's debug it. So if you see, we have not exported this validation directive from our forms module. So what we will have to do, we will have to go to the forms module, and first we will have to declare the required validation directive here, and then we will export it so that it can be used or it can be applied, in the use case component, in the app component. Now let's check. Okay, now let's run that utility again, and let's check if, okay, first we will have to select the node which you want to inspect, and now you can see this required validator, it is applied correctly. So now it should validate it correctly. Oh great, it is validating it. Yeah, and do the same for the second. Yeah, please provide the, yes. So you can see how we moved, how we transformed our the form validation behavior in the ngModel, and how we move it to another directive. So now you will see it is very easy to scale the validation in the ngModel. So all we have to do is like define another directive and configuring this DI token, right? For now, this ng validator DI token is, it returns the single validation directive, right? But we can configure it to provide us an array of directives. Suppose we have applied more directives on that element, like this DI token as a multi-provider DI token, then we will get access to array of directives which we have applied on that element, and through that array we can compose a single validator function and apply it on the form control. So this way we can also accept a custom validation by defining a custom validator directive and configuring that directive on that ng validator DI token. So that's all from this video, and let's see you in the next video where we will apply a couple of more directives on the input, and then we will modify the validation flow to accept more than one validation on a particular input. Till then, bye bye.